Well, good morning. Here we are again on Sunday morning to go through a Bible study. I might also say Happy Easter, because you know there are two church traditions in Christianity and they have a different calendar. So the Eastern Church, sometimes referred to as the Orthodox Church, is celebrating Easter today rather than last Sunday. So we're still in that Easter season, celebrating the fact that Jesus rose. And He is our salvation. So we've been looking at over the last few weeks what the lesson writer has referred to as the DNA of a disciple. What is it that defines who we are? Like DNA of the body defines who we are physically, but what defines us spiritually? And what we discovered in the very first lesson by looking at several passages was the fact that it all starts with the love of Jesus. And it's not just the love of Jesus shown to us, but as followers, as disciples of Jesus, then He expects us to show that to everyone else. Because remember, we started off that first lesson using the story of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus was showing an example of, well, who do you show God's love to? Well, you show it to everybody, even the people you despise, the people you hate, or whatever it might be, you show it to everybody. And so then that was all about the priority of love. It's the first thing. Without the love of Jesus being the controlling part of who we are spiritually, we really can't live out the other attributes the way Jesus had intended them to be lived out. And so then we went on and we looked at, well, what's the measure of love? And the measure of love, the timing was just right, because that led right up to Easter, to say that, well, Jesus showed us that in terms of willing to go to the cross because in order to show us God's love and to show us the way that we can come and be reconciled with God. And so this week we're going to look at another attribute of love, and that is the endurance of love. The endurance of love. So, it's not always easy to endure. In a way, we're seeing a bit of that now in terms of what's going on with the COVID virus that is going around. We're having to endure a lot of inconveniences, a lot of things, doing things different than we would have done before. But can we endure? Well, if you think about it, the whole lifetime of a disciple has attributes of enduring in the love of Jesus, no matter what might come along. Jesus showed that in the very beginning. If we go, let's go to John, the 12th chapter. John spends about half of his gospel in that last week of Jesus' ministry on earth. So to John, that was the real pivotal part of what Jesus came for. So let's look at John in the 12th chapter. And we're going to look at what Jesus had told His disciples during that last week before He was arrested, before He went to crucifixion. And so we'll start with the 27th verse. And this is Jesus talking. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? Now remember, this is before. Okay, this is before. But for this purpose I came to this hour. So Jesus was acknowledging that this was leading up to the act of love that He came for. And so then He goes on, He says, Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. Therefore the people who stood by and heard it said, as it thundered, others said, well, an angel has spoken to him. And Jesus answered and said, this voice did not come because of me, but for your sake. Okay, not because of me, but for your sake. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the rulers of this world will be cast out. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. This He said, signifying what death He would die. Now, sometimes, people have extracted just a phrase out of that 32nd verse, if I be lifted up. But if you take the whole sentence, then what was Jesus talking about? Well, once again, because he'd already told his disciples at least twice before about what was going to happen to him in Jerusalem, that he was going to be arrested, he was going to be crucified, but on the third day he would rise again. And so once more he's referring to that, lifted up on the cross, because that's what he came for. And so the cross is love in action. We've talked about the thing that we've looked at in many of the passages where Jesus had talked to his disciples, that he used action verbs most all of the time. So he expects action. Well, he was acting that out here in terms of going to the cross for us. And in fact, this theme is picked up again back in Hebrews. So if we go to Hebrews, the 12th chapter, and we're going to read the first 3 verses of that as they're being reminded. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance, the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. Now, isn't that an interesting way to phrase it? For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. In other words, Jesus knew that it may not be pleasant, it may not be desirable, it was necessary in order to complete God's love for us. Despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility for sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. So the writer of Hebrews is telling these first century Christians that, well, you really need to understand that, endurance is part of it. Endurance is part of any kind of struggle toward a goal that is not easily attained. But you notice he's reminding in the second verse there, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, saying, well, that's where our strength and sustenance comes from in order to be able to endure to the end. And so love, as we looked in a previous lesson at the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, which is that famous love chapter that describes that. So remember, some of the attributes of love that Paul listed to the church at Corinth in that letter is that love bore all things, hopes all things, and remember, endures all things. And so endurance is part of that living out the love of Jesus in our lives. Love did not fail. Love will not fail. Love wins. So love endures also short-sightedness. Here's a statement that the lesson writer made that I thought was a very good one to repeat. Human nature desires the path of least resistance and to achieve goals quickly and painlessly. And I don't think it's very hard just not to look around at what goes on all around us to recognize that, human nature desires the path of least resistance and to achieve goals quickly and painlessly. We're experiencing that right now as a people in our country because of what the virus has done to totally disrupt our lives and our livelihood, which is a serious thing. Well, Jesus, if you remember, always told his disciples that you need to be looking toward the goal, not toward the today, or not toward the what you want it to be, but rather what it needs to be. And remember that he had that famous encounter with Peter where he made this point very, very strongly. With all of his disciples standing around. So let's go back to Matthew, the 16th chapter. And we're going to start with the 21st verse. And it says, "From that time Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes." So notice that Matthew is describing here that, so notice he says, he began to show to his disciples. So Matthew is also pointing out that Jesus said these things to his disciples several times, more than once. It shouldn't have been a surprise to them if they were paying attention and listening to what Jesus was having to say. Let's see. "Many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day." So he's talking to his disciples here. "Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him." Can you imagine? Okay, so Peter's rebuking Jesus, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, okay, this is Jesus, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. For what profit is there a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" So Jesus is being very, very emphatic with all of this. And he says, and also notice, to put this in context, if you back up a little bit in Matthew 16, what had just happened right before this? Well, Peter had acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was God with us. And Jesus had blessed him and said, that you have recognized rightly. So what got in the way? What got in the way between verses 17 and 18 and down here in verses 22 and 23? Well, we know from other passages in the Gospels, in the New Testament, that the disciples had come to follow Jesus because of their preconceived notion of what the Messiah would be. The Messiah would be a political, military, economic conqueror. And so they thought they were being chosen to be the inner circle, so that when this kingdom, the physical kingdom, got set up, they would be in the leadership group. They would be the ones who would be privileged. They would be the ones that would have it all. Not the Romans any longer. So Jesus was rebuking and saying, you've got it all wrong, and you're not looking ahead to what God's full intent is. So the disciples of Jesus were called upon to see the big picture. We're called upon to see the big picture as disciples. So we have to embrace the ongoing, sacrificial, and life-changing lifestyle of what? Of the cross. That's what Jesus kept referring to throughout his ministry. This sacrificial love on the behalf of others in order to fulfill the big picture purpose that God has for us. The lesson writer also made another statement that I thought was very pertinent to what we're talking about. And he says, "How has the prosperity doctrine polluted what it means to be a disciple of Jesus?" Now, in case you're not familiar with that, the prosperity doctrine says that, well, if you're Jesus' disciple, you love Jesus and Jesus loves you, then Jesus is just going to make you wealthy, famous, comfortable, whatever. And of course, Jesus warned his disciples over and over again. He says, if you want to be my disciple, you better count the cost, because this isn't going to be an easy path, but it's a necessary path in terms of what we're going on. So what do you think? Ponder that one a little bit today. Has the prosperity doctrine diverted our attention away from what it means to live the love of Jesus in terms of what we have. So we often look for the blessing of God to be shown in financial ways, or lives devoid of conflict, or lives devoid of pain. You know, that's part and parcel of what you might call a prosperity doctrine. To say, well, I'm a follower of Jesus. Jesus loves me, so nothing ever bad is going to happen to me. Only good is going to happen to me. And that's not what happened in terms of the life of the disciples. It certainly wasn't true in the first century. All you have to do is read throughout the gospel and read the historical writings of the first century to know that was not true. They had to endure. And they had to endure some pretty miserable kinds of things. Well, Jesus, in fact, promised the opposite. Promised the opposite. Let's go back to John and go to the 16th chapter of John, starting with the 31st verse. And so we're getting, as John records it, see, we're getting close to the end of the ministry. You know, the cross is not very far off, and Jesus is continuing to teach his disciples to try to get them to understand, you know, what was happening and why. And of course, as we know, looking backward at it, they didn't understand at all until after the resurrection in terms of what Jesus was trying to say to them. So let's look at the John 16, starting with the 31st verse. You get over to that. Jesus answered them, "Do you now believe? Indeed, the hour is coming, yes, has now come, that you will be scattered, each to his own, and will leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." So Jesus is telling them just not long before he's going to be arrested, because they're, again, acting like, okay, we've had this triumphal entry into Jerusalem, you know, now is the time. All of this Messiah belief, the way they had believed it traditionally, was going to come to pass. And he's telling them, first of all, well, not long from now, you all are going to be scattered back in your own home. What's another way of saying that? You're going to go off and hide, and you're going to leave me alone when I have to face what's coming. But notice the endurance of the love of Jesus. He loves them. And he says that you will come to know. And after you know, then you will be able to live the life that I have asked you to live. So notice what Jesus was instructing to his disciples. You have to first understand what the love of God means in our lives, how we live our lives, an action verb. And then once we understand what that means and we live it, Jesus says, well, you will have the endurance. Peace. This isn't a physical peace. This is a spiritual peace, knowing that we are one with God because we have understood and lived the love of God in our lives. Well, next week we'll continue on and look at another aspect of what it means to have love as the priority in our lives. So I hope you have a great week.